Okay, then? So now we get back to the sugya that we got stuck on yesterday. And that sugya is here on Daf Lamed Ches at the very bottom of Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. So I'm going to suggest that because of the complexity of this sugya, we're going to sort of jump ahead of ourselves. We'll read through the Gemara and see if the best that we can do to try to understand what's going on. So if you're on Daf Lamed Ches, you're 4 lines above the end of the Amud. So everybody have it. We're on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, 4 lines up before the end of the Amud. And because, as I said before, this is a very, very challenging sugya, we're going to just try to get out of it whatever we can. I'm not guaranteeing, that we're going to come out with a 7-piece band, and celebrate our success in understanding this sugya. As we saw yesterday, this sugya is an overlap of Masechet Ksubis, of laws of inheritance. The ksuba divides up into many different parts. There's the gufa ksuba, the ikra ksuba, which is Mana Matzayim, and then there are parts of the ksuba that are reflective of those possessions that she brought into the marriage. But that's only part of the sugya. The other part of the sugya has to do with the status of a yavam before he materializes the yibum, and she dies as a shomeres yavam. And the question is, her possessions, do they really belong to her? And now that she dies, her father will inherit her. Or do her possessions belong to the yavam because of the principle of ksuba and a bal yorishus ishto? A husband gets first rights to inherit his wife. But now we're talking about a yavam, we're not talking about a husband. Again, if the yavam had already implemented yibum, then she's a full-fledged HSH and there'd be no debate. But there's a confusion about the status of a woman who falls for yibum and there was no yibum, and now she dies. Does the yavam get rights to inherit her? And what we saw in the Mishnah, just to review, is that Beis Hillel have a principle called Bechezkas Yorshei Ha'av, which means that we're going to circumvent the yavam and we're going to ignore him. And the reason for that is because it's only a shomeres yavam, meaning although she felt the yibum never was actualized, was never realized. So the yavam never became the husband of this wife, and therefore any possessions that she owns belong to her father, which is called Chezkas Yorshei Ha'av. Steve, can I trouble you for a favor if you could bring in a stender for me, or maybe even 2, but I'm sorry to bother you, but I think it would be helpful for me. We have, okay, I'm just going to take a minute to sort of relocate, so if you can, bear with me. I bet Don and Ruve never thought I would be strong enough to pick both of you up, right? That's because I became Hercules. Thanks. So that's called, in the language of the Mishnah, Bechezkas Yorshei Ha'av. And in our language, that means that these are her properties, her possessions. There's no husband who could inherit her when she dies because he's only a Yavam and he hasn't yet been miyabim her. And he never will be able to be miyabim her, obviously. She died. What's much more challenging is the status of her ksuba. And Beis Hillel differentiate between the ksuba, whatever that means, we'll get back to that, and nechasim hayotzim hanichnasim v'yotzim ima. Those nechasim that were always hers, she brought it into the marriage, she still owns the guf hanechasim. Again, it could be that the Baal, in the framework of ksuba, gets certain rights to hanechasim, like if she owns a piece of property, he could rent out the property and collect the rental fees, but the property itself is hers. And that's called nichsei maluk. And that's called the chasim hanichnasim v'yotzim ima. In other words, she brought them into the marriage, and with the termination of that marriage, she takes it out of the marriage. So when her husband dies, those nechasim which she brought into the marriage remain hers, or shall we say, revert back to her possession. Whatever rights her husband had in payros, right, rental fees and so forth, that's all gone when her husband dies. Now, even though she fell for yibum, but as we said before, the nechasim of becheskes ha'av, the yavam has never implemented yibum, and therefore they remain her possession. So in essence, whatever rights her first husband, her late husband had in her nechasim, those rights go down into the kever. You know, they're buried with the death of the husband. And therefore now her ownership rights to her, let's call it real estate that she brought into the marriage, now whatever ownership rights her late husband had, which we call payros, those no longer exist. And now the real estate that she brought into the marriage is her real estate. Now, when she dies, her father inherits her because there's no husband. Her husband died. There's a yavam. The yavam was not quick enough to be mekayim the mitzvah of yibum and fulfill and actualize the zikas yibum, and therefore he has no rights to the nechasim. But now we talk about the ksuba. What does that mean, the ksuba? We're not talking about possessions and, let's say, property that she brought into the marriage, but rather we're talking about monies that a husband obligates himself in to pay his wife. And that sum of money would be collected from the husband's estate in event that he dies. We'll call it 200 zuz. Now, a man marries a woman, and there's a lien, L-I-E-N, on his property to pay 200 zuz out of his property in event that he dies. And again, if he divorces her, the same is true. But let's focus on our case. Our case is a case where Reuven was married to, we'll call her Sarah, and Reuven dies. At this point, Sarah has rights to collect 200 zuz from the estate of her late husband. And Beis Hillel say in such a case, Arein b'chezkas yorshei haba. What happened? Instead of her collecting the ksuba, which she had theoretically rights to do the moment that her husband Reuven died, she didn't get a chance to collect that ksuba, and she died. If she died and she never, in Hebrew we say lemamesh, which means to realize, actualize her rights to the ksuba now remains in the estate of her husband. Because although Reuven, her first husband, was obligated, so to speak, with his death, to transfer the money of the ksuba over to her, which means that she could collect her ksuba from his estate, that never happened. Instead, what happened is she fell for Yibum. And insofar as her falling for Yibum is concerned, we freeze, if I can use that term, we freeze the rights or the lien of Shibu, the mortgage of the late Reuven's estate. We freeze it wherever it is. And that's called the Chezkas Yorshei Abal. And in this case, we're not sure who the Yorshei Abal are, but maybe the Yavam himself, as a brother, could be considered Yorshei Abal. More likely, the Yorshei Abal would be the father of Reuven. Let's call him Yaakov, if he's still alive. If Reuven, Yaakov's son, died during the lifetime of Reuven, never, then Reuven now becomes the Yorshei Abal. And the ksuba value of 200 zuz, which was sort of inside the estate, if you follow me, of Reuven, now would be inherited after the death of Reuven by Yaakov. If Yaakov's not around, then Shimon, the brother of Reuven, would have inheritance rights to that ksuba. And this is what, as far as we got yesterday, in trying to understand Beis Hill's distinction between ksuba on the one hand, which is bechezkas Yorshei Abal, and echosim ha'nichnasim v'yotzim imo, which are bechezkas Yorshei Ha'av. But Beis Shammai complicates the story with a principle called yachloku, a ruling of splitting between two claimants of this inheritance. We call it contestants, maybe? I don't know what word we want to use, claimants or contestants. There are two people claiming her inheritance. And Beit Shammai is going to apply the principle of Yachlok. Who are these two groups? These are the Yorshei Abal and the Yorshei Ha'av. And Beit Shammai is going to say Yachlok. And Yachloku means that Beit Shammai is willing to recognize, again, as a suffix, keep that in mind, but he's willing to recognize the Yavam as the husband of this, who do we call her? What name do we give her? Sarah? Shimon, the brother, the surviving brother of the late Reuven, is now stepping into Reuven's shoes as if he were married to Reuven's wife, Sarah, even though he never actualized that yibum. Again, it's only a suffix. But that suffix, which is a tzad, that grants or generates rights of Yerusha to Shimon, the Yavam, those suffix rights will be translated into a chalukah. Okay, so that's as far as we got in explaining the Seifa of the Mishnah. There's a Reisha to the Mishnah, which again I'd like to review with you, and that's called Shomeres Yavam Shenaful Nechasim. And we were trying yesterday to rack our brains and figure out exactly what the scenario, what was the facts on the ground. So we'll only be able to present the facts on the scenario in a general sense. There are some pieces of the puzzle that are still waiting to be redeemed. What happens is that Reuven dies and his wife Rivka falls for Yibum to Shimon. At that moment, Rivka's father dies and leaves an estate. And in such a case, everybody, both Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, agree that the Yavam is out of the picture. He has no rights whatsoever to the Chasim that fall to the Yevamot, to Sarah, during the period of time between the death of Reuven and the Yibum of Shimon. So it's post Reuven's death, but it's pre Shimon's Yibum. In that slice of time, even Beit Shammai agree that the Yavam has no claim whatsoever to monies that come into the possession of the Yevamah of Sarah as a result of the death of her father. She inherits her father, and the Yavam has no yad, he has no acquisition or possession over those nechasim. She can therefore go ahead and sell those nechasim, and the sale is absolutely valid. No one could undermine and invalidate that sale. And that's called, in the language of the Mishnah, Mocheres v'nosenes b'kayo. Let's take a look at the Gemara. And again, I warn you, we're really overlapping so many different elements and dimensions and sugyas. Maishna reisha de lo pligi, umaishna sefer de pligi. And the way we can explain the Gemara's question is if we focus on Beit Shammai. In the case of the Sefer, which we said was a Yevamah that died, and what happens to the possessions of the Yevamah, there we said that there was no, let me get this right, so let's get back to the Sefer in a minute. Let's start with the Reish. In the Reish, there's no machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. It means the same Beit Shammai, and keep this in mind, that upgrades the status of the Yavam before Yibum and gives him half of the estate. That same Beit Shammai completely neutralizes the rights of the Yavam in the Reisha when Sarah, the Yevamah's father, dies before Yibum, and those nechasim are now inherited by Sarah, and she could sell them on the open market with the valid sale to the exclusion of the Yavam. The Yavam is out of the picture. The same Beit Shammai in the Sefer disagree with Beis Hillel and recognize, again mitzad sofek, the rights of the Yavam to the inheritance of Sarah, his wife, who's not his wife, who's his Yevamah, and such that when she dies, Beit Shammai is going to award half of her estate to the Yavam, which means that Beit Shammai equate Zikas Yibum with marriage. What gives the Yavam rights to inherit the Yavama when she dies? It's got to be under the principle called Baal Yoresh Ishto. And although Beit Shammai is not certain about this, there still is a suffix. He's going to say Yachloku, and he certainly is willing to recognize the possibility that the Yavam has no rights to inherit the Yavama, but nevertheless, he's open, and it has halachic ramifications, to recognizing the Yavam's rights to inherit his wife. But she's not his wife. Al Korchenu, we have no choice but to assume that Beit Shammai defines the Zika as if there's a marriage relationship between the Yavam and the Yavama even before he implements Yibum, such that now with her death, the Yavam is a Baldover. He is like a Bailim to inherit his wife, even though she's not his wife. And if that logic is compelling, according to Beit Shammai, then we don't understand the ratio. When she inherits her father's possessions as a Yavama, why doesn't the Yavam have rights to those possessions such that he can block her ability to sell those properties? It's very similar to a case of a married woman who inherits money, and the Baal has rights to that money. What rights does he have? If it's Nifsei Malug, he has rights to the payros. If it's Nifsei Tzon Barzel, he has a right to the Nechasim themselves, to the Guf HaKarka. Whatever his rights are, but he certainly has the ability and the legal rights to block her sale. And now Beit Shammai is saying, I agree to Beis Hillel, the Yavam is out of the picture. He has no rights whatsoever. And what she inherits from her father, she sells on the open market. Whatever they let the Yavam scream till doomsday and bring down the house, it's irrelevant. He's a Yavam, but he hasn't implemented the evil. Why then did Beit Shammai insist on upgrading the Yavam to the status of a Baal in the Sefer of the Mishnah to generate the halacha of Yachlok b'Safek in a case where she dies? Omar Ula, Reisha did nafla kshi arusa, Seifa did nafla kishehi nesua. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty details and the nuances of Ula, I would like to say the following, that Ula is of the opinion that there really is no way of reconciling the Reish and the Sefer. There's no integrity here to this Mishnah. What I mean by integrity is, if you read the Mishnah as is, there's an inner contradiction in the Mishnah. It's impossible to reconcile the Reish and the Sefer. What we're going to have to do, therefore, and we've seen this before in Shas, is when there's no possibility of reconciling the Reish and the Sefer of a Mishnah, what we do is we do what's called an ukimta. Ukimta means the Reish is talking about one set of circumstances and the Sefer another set of circumstances. That's the methodology that Ula is going to apply here, because the back is against the wall. There's no other option. That's certainly not lechatchila, the smoothest way of interpreting a Mishnah, by introducing different ukimtas. The Reish is talking about this case, the Sefer that, but we have like Chisur Mechsur and other kinds of principles in which we are forced to do such a thing. Okay. Now we know that in marriage there's Erisin and there's Nesuin. Erisin is the lower ebb echelons. That's the beginning of marriage, of Ishus, but the real clincher of Ishus is Nesuin, which is otherwise known as Chuppah. Today we do everything under the chuppah. Erisin, Harei Mekudeshes Li B'Tabasu, and Nesuin under the chuppah. But in the old days, it was a 12-month separation between Erisin and Nesuin. I'm just reviewing the Aleph Beis. You know this without me. What happens in the Reisha? There was never a full-fledged marriage between Sarah and Reuven. There was only Erison, and then Reuven died. So what we have now, if we want to use the precise terminology, is with the death of Reuven following his Erison to Sarah, and he has no children, we have a situation of Shomeres Yavam Min HaErison. And now that the blackboard is empty, we could write on the blackboard. Jeff took it upon himself to clean this whiteboard here. So we're talking about Shomeres Yavam Min HaErison. In the Sefer, we're talking about Reuven taking Sarah into the chuppah before he died, and with his death, the status of Sarah is Shomeres Yavam Min HaNesuin. Do you have it? So the Reisha is Shomeres Yavam Min HaErison, the Sefer is Shomeres Yavam Min HaNesuin. What's going to be the difference? The Gemara explains, Kasavar Ula, Zika, Arusa, Osa. Okay, now we have to move slowly. What is the status of a Shomeres Yavam Min HaErison? In this case, the Zika is a lower second case Zika. And therefore, Osa Kisafek Arusa. We have here A, B, and C, 3 levels, 3 strata. We've got the marriage relationship between Sarah and Reuven. That's called Erison. And then, with the death of Reuven, we have a lower relationship of Ishus between Sarah and Shimon. And that's called Zika of a Yevamot Min HaErison. In between those two is what's called the Shomeres Yavam Min HaNesuin. And in that case, although the Ishus dips below full-fledged Ishus of Nesuin, because it's only the next generation, but it's called a Zika that's equal to Erison. If, on the other hand, she was a Shomeres Yavam Min HaErison, then we go down below Erison when we get to Zika with the death of her husband. So we dip below the level of Erison. And that's called, in the language of Ula, Safek Arusa. And now we go back to the Reisha. we say that the Reisha is a case of Nafla Shehi Arusa, which means that Ruvain had only implemented Erisin before he died. And with his death, his wife Sarah becomes a Zika of Shomeres Yavam Min HaErisin. Says Beit Shammai, in such a case, her status in relationship to the Yavam is that of a Safek Arusa. And the phrase Safek Arusa means one notch below Erisin. Below Erisin. You follow? Had there been a full marriage of Nisuin before Reuven died, then we would go down to a Zika, which is Erisin. But since there was no full-fledged marriage of Nisuin between Reuven and Sarah during its lifetime, he only achieved the Erisin, then we go down a level to Zika, and now the Zika is below the level of Erisin, because we started with Erisin for the first husband, and the Yavam now goes below that level of Ishus, dipping below Erisin, which is called the Safek Arusa. Had there been Nisuin, which is going to be the Sefer of our Mishnah, then we go down one level from the Ishus of Nisuin between Reuven and Sarah, and we end up with a Zika, which equals Erisin. But now we're talking about in the Reisha a case where there was only Erisin to begin with, and Reuven died before the Nisuin. Now we go down a level below Erisin, and we dip to the level of Zika of a Shomeres Yavam Min HaErisin, and that's called the Safek Arusa. Safek Arusa means it's a lower level of Ishus than Erisin. You have Nisuin, you have Erisin, and now you have something lower than Erisin, which is called Shomeres Yavam Min HaErisin, which is Zika that's below Erisin. Oh. Now, if the Zika relationship between Shimon and Rivka after the death of Reuven, that Zika to Shimon is very, what's the word I want to use? Not precarious. What's the word I want? It's very, what's the word? Tenuous. Tenuous, very tenuous. It's so tenuous, it doesn't even reach the level of Erisin. And now, what's her name again? Rivka. We call her Sarah Rivka. What do we call her? I forget. You guys have to remind me which name I think we gave her the name Sarah. I'm not sure. Anyway, now Sarah's father dies, and she inherits her father. He has no claim to her possessions, even according to Beit Shammai. Here was Beit Shammai, who were the champion of the Yavam, and they were giving the Yavam rights to inherit the Yevama when she dies in the Sefer. But in the Reisha, she's the Yevama Min Erisin. And the Yevama Min Erisin has a Zika that dips below Erisin. And the final product of that is that, or the bottom line is that the Yavam, we'll call him Shimon, has no rights whatsoever to the Nechasim of Sarah. Why? Because he is only at a level of below Erisin. Therefore, the Arusa is allowed to sell the Nechasim that she inherits from the father. Now, there's a long discussion here about whether or not lechatchila in the Reisha she's allowed to sell her nechas without the approval of the Yavam. And the possibility exists that although in this case, again, a shomeres Yavam in a Erison, the nechasim belong to her, but nevertheless, lechatchila, she should not be selling those nechasim. However, what I just told you now is not really true. And in our Mishnah, in the Reisha, she's allowed to sell the nechasim even lechatchila. What confuses us is the case of an arusa. Let's say in a regular marriage situation, a woman gets married, but only Eris. 12 months from now, there's going to be Nisuin. She's got a lot of possessions. Some are bat mitzvah presents. Some are Yerusha, whatever she has. Maybe she was in employment. She earned wages. She's not allowed to sell her nechas. Once it's Erison, there's a bond between the Oris and the Arutza, such that although technically his status as an Oris after Erison is not enough to block her mechira of her possessions, she owns them, he only takes over the ownership to some extent of her possessions with Nisuin, but nevertheless, we want to avoid a situation where once a woman has connected herself to someone with a bond of Erison, she should not be opening up a free, laissez-faire market with all her possessions and sell them carte blanche. She should be anticipating the ultimate marriage relationship, but not in the case of Yibum. In the case of a shomeres Yavam in a Erison, she's her own agent. She did nothing to bind, I got that right, to bind herself to the Yavam. The Torah binds her to the Yavam. But in this case, where we're talking about a Yevama mina Erison, so now what are you going to say? Well, since when Reuven was alive, she was not, it was only Erison, she would not be allowed to sell her nechas. Okay, fine. That's because there's some sort of a bond through Erison, the marriage is on its way. Now Reuven dies, and we said that the Zika takes us down one level. So it's not even on the level of Erison, then even lechatchila she's allowed to sell the nechas. So that's what we have here on Daf Lamed Ches. Now we move on to Lamed Ches Amud Beis. And we're still talking about Ula. So again, let's just reiterate. Ula holds that in the case of a Zika through Erison, the Zika is called a Safek Arus, which again is a level that dips below Erison. Now the Gemara says the following. Zika Nisuin Osa Safek Nisuin. Zikas Nisua Osa Safek Nisuin. Now I believe that Ula is now addressing the Sefer of our Mishnah because he uses the word Nisua, and we said that the Reisha is talking about an Arusa, and now we shift to an Nesua, we must be shifting over to the Sefer of our Mishnah. So what happens? A woman is married with Nesua in full-fledged marriage to Shimon. That's the status of Sarah. And now Reuven dies. Now she has a Zika, which is called Safek Nesua. And as we said before, Safek reduces or drops you one, what was the word we want to use? One level, one madriga. It lowers you one madriga. So that's called Safek Nesua. What do you say?
One notch.
One notch. Excellent. So she drops one notch from a Nesua to a Safek Nesua. Okay. Now, again, a woman after the suin cannot sell her nechasim without the approval of her husband. If she went ahead and she engaged or implemented such a sale, the husband has a right to negate and void that sale, such that now the sale will revert back in as if it never had taken place. So Nesua, this is a summary of the Rashi on the top of the Amud. Nesua shemachra v'nasta af b'di'eved abal motzi v'dei lekukos. Do you see that? But now we get to the next level, going down one notch, as Dan says, as Dan says very well. Because we're talking about a case where Reuven dies, and now the relationship between Reuven's wife and his surviving brother, we call him Shimon, is that of Zika. So there's no Nesuin to the Yevamot. We call it a Safek Nesuin. It's one notch lower. So what's the status of a Safek Nesua, Zika of a Safek Nesua? Here's where we have a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai want to recognize that Zika, because we called it Safek Nesua, as a Safek. And therefore, any properties that come into her possession, after she dies, the Yavam has rights to collect those possessions as if they were married, because Baal Yorish is Ichto, and there's one side of the Safek that she is already in a Nesua to the Yavam. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, say Safek Nesua is not a Nesua. There's no status of the Yavam as a Baal, because Safek Nesua dips below, it's one notch below a Nesua, and any properties that come into her possession belong to her, and with her death, to her heirs, meaning her father. So Beit Shammai view this as a Safek, who really inherits her properties. And therefore, we're going to divide it up equally, Yachloku, according to Beit Shammai, between the Yorshei HaBaal and the Yorshei HaAv. Beis Hillel hold that Safek Nesuin, meaning Zika, is not enough to consider her Nesua. It's not like she's halfway there and she's halfway married to the Yavam. She's zero. It's qualitatively below that status of Nesua. That's where Zika drops one notch. Are you with me, Don? I don't know, you look like you're very preoccupied. I don't know.
I understand the idea that it's not recognized. I don't understand why. I forget it's Beit Shammai. Why it feels you can split the two. Well, what right does the Yavam?
Because Beit Shammai say that a suffix nesua is a real bona fide suffix, meaning since the Yavam is taking over for his brother, and the Torah is thrusting Shimon, meaning the Yavam, into the shoes of his late brother Reuven, then just like Reuven had rights to the nechasim of his wife, because that's called nesuin, Shimon now gains the nesuin status vis-a-vis what's her name, Sarah.
But if you gave chalitza, you'd have no rights, right?
Correct. Okay. After chalitza, he's out of the picture. But we're talking before chalitza. She died after her husband died. No major event took place in between her husband's death, Reuven, and her death, Sarah. So now, what happens to the nechasim that she accrues before her death during this period of Zikas Yibum? If we view Zika as an extension of the marriage that she had to Reuven, the late Reuven, and that was Nesuin, then after Nesuin, Abal Yorish is Ishto. The Yavam will now inherit her possessions. But that's only a Safek Nesuin. Because as we said before, Zika is not the same as the original Nesuin. It drops one level. He hasn't yet implemented Yibum. Therefore, B'Torah Safek, we have two claimants that are equal, tug of war of two equal forces. One are the Yarshim of her husband, which in this case might very well be Shimon, his brother, it might be his father, Yaakov, and the Yarshim of Sarah, namely her father, on the side that Nesuin, that Zika, is not Nesuin. So Beit Shammai says, what do we do with this case? We don't know how to define Zika after Nesuin. In the case of Zika after Erisin, and you dip below the level of the Erisin, that's called Safek Arusa, then Beit Shammai would agree to Beis Hillel that the Yavam has no rights whatsoever. He's out of the picture. But in the case of a Shomeres Yavam Mina Nesuin, where Shimon had a full-fledged marriage with Sarah, now there's a tzad to say, that's where Beit Shammai vacillate, Safek Nesuin, that Zika, meaning Shimon's relationship to his wife immediately after the death of his brother Reuven, is that of a Safek Nesua, which means that there's 50% pull in the direction of Nesuin, and then if there's Nesuin, then he's Yorish Ishto. On the other hand, Beit Shammai agreed that there's a 50% chance that it's less than Nesuin, because Zika, as we said, always goes down one notch, and therefore he has no rights to possession. So what we're going to do is we're going to split it between the Yorshei Abal and the Yorshei Ha'av. And Beis Hillel, on the other hand, they say that there's no such thing as half pregnant. You can't have half Nesuin. It's qualitatively less than Nesuin, and the Yavam is out of the picture. Therefore, the Yorshei Ha'av will inherit her possession. So let's read the Gemara inside. We're going to have to end very soon. I see it's getting late. All right, we'll just, at least to finish the sentence of the Gemara says, Zikas Arusa Ose Safek Arusa, Visal Kedai Vadai Arusa. If we were to say that Zikas Arusa is Vade Arusa, Modim, Beis Hillel, Shemocheres V'Nosenes Kayom, which would sound like the Mishnah seems to indicate that in the Reisha, she has free rights, laissez-faire, to sell her nechasim, even lechatchila. How could that be? If you're telling me that from Erisin we get Erisin, meaning if the relationship to the late brother Reuven was that of Erisin, so therefore after his death, her relationship to Shimon is Vade Arusa, is then how could it be that Beis Hillel would agree that Mocheres v'nosenes for Snan, and now the Gemara is going to quote a Mishnah in Ksubis to prove that after Erisin, a woman is not allowed to sell her possessions. L'chatchilu. Naflu anachasim mibeis anvia mishenis arsa Beit Shammai omrim timkar ubeis Hillel omrim lo tim. Beis Hillel say that you bind yourself up to an arus, and therefore don't sell the nechasim. L'chatchilu, we're not going to allow that. But elu modim shem machra v'nas nakayim. Even Beis Hillel would agree that the arus does not have rights to her possession until Nisuin, before Nisuin, and he cannot block her sale. It's therefore if she went ahead and she sold her possessions, the sale is valid. The elu modim shem machra v'nas nakayim. Elishma mina zikas arusa osa safek arusa. Again, if it was a vade arusa, then we would block her from selling her nechasim l'chatchila. Again, the evidence, if she went ahead and took the law into her own hands, we'd have to validate that marriage because Erisin is not married in the full sense. He doesn't acquire ownership over her possessions with Erisin. But in a real case of an arusa, a full-fledged arusa, Beis Hillel insists that we're going to block her ability to sell the nechasim l'chatchila. We're not going to allow it. But in the case of a yavam, how are you defining the yavam in the Reish of Mishnah? Are you calling the yavam a vadei arus or a safek arus? And the Gemara says, I'm going to prove to you that it's not a vadei arus because the Mishnah establishes that according to everyone, unanimously, even Beit Shammai, mocheres v'nosenes. That's a lashon of lechatchila. If it's a vadei arusa, then Beis Hillel would not allow her to sell the possessions. Lechatchila. But it must be that we're talking about a safek arusa, and in a safek arusa, which, as we said, is a qualitatively low notch below a erisin, she is allowed to sell her possessions even lechatchila. Okay, so this is where we're going to stop for today. Let's just make a note of it. I only know that tomorrow is going to be Tuesday because I heard Kriyas HaTorah. All right. Okay, then Rabbosai. So I hope
just a quick question.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. With the suffix arusa would also mean that it be a suffix that the Yavam can make for her vows, and he falls to a veilus as well.
He would be excluded from all of his rights as a married husband. Her nedarim are in her father's possession or in hers, depending upon how old she is, etc. He has no shaykhs to it. Why? Because she's a safek arusa, which means that she's one notch below an arusa. And that means that he has no rights to anything that belongs to her, whether it's her nedarim, whether it's Yerucha, whether it's her ability to sell the nechas. Okay then? All right, Shkar, thank you so much.